We count 7 unicorns in Africa, and our guest is one of them. For this new Real Business Talk, we will dive in the business of GO1, one of the biggest edtech company in Africa, with his CEO, Melvyn Lubega.
In this episode, you will learn how GO1 succeeded in joining Y-Combinator and what has changed in their business path since then, how to convince the biggest investors of the world, what are the main evolutions of the tech ecosystem in Africa lately. From Africa to the world with Melvyn Lubega.
Hello, Melvyn.
Hey
Hi.
guys. No, thank you for having me.
We are very happy to have you here
Really
for
great
this
conversation.
first episode of African Business Maker Real Business Talk.
Yeah.
Bam, 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 bam.
So we will dig into your business GO1 and also your investor role at Briga. So are you ready?
No, ready. Keen for the conversation.
Let's go.
So you founded GO1 10 years ago, and it's now worth $2 billion. So it's become a unicorn in Africa. Why do you think there are so few unicorns in Africa?
I think so few is obviously relative to where you start. I mean, for example, a few weeks ago, actually last week, Matty, the team at 11 Labs, became the first unicorn in Poland.
Yes.
So again, like it comes down to market maturity. I think what you will see is more unicorns come into the continent. But I think historically, what makes someone a unicorn? It means someone has seen value in your business that's north of $1 billion. Doesn't necessarily mean you aren't building a big business or you have big revenues or small revenues. And so I think often what you found is because of the, let's call it the nascence of the African VC market, there weren't that many VCs putting billion dollar valuations on companies. I think Africa naturally is a bigger market than most countries around the world. But the reality is I think there wasn't that maturity to see the value. But I think that will definitely change. Because if you look at the numbers in Africa alone, it only stands to reason. Look, you have about $115 billion worth of digital economy in Africa. And only 33% of the continent's actually on the internet. And so even as you close that gap from a macro perspective, it should ultimately lead to more valuable businesses and opportunities in the market.
When you start GO1, what was the mission you had and how that mission has evolved in time?
So I grew a horn on my head and then I get...
Colorful.
So it's interesting, when you think about, especially being in a tech startup where you're raising capital, it's really humbling for partners such as finance investors to see value in the business of what we're building. But I think for us as entrepreneurs, you often are building for something bigger than the valuation. And so for us, it was like a normal day in the office, but obviously you want to take a moment to appreciate that. But ultimately, the $1 billion valuation or unicorn valuation means that, as I mentioned earlier briefly, that someone has invested in your business at a valuation that is post $1 billion. And so we're very fortunate that particular round we had was led between Salesforce Ventures and SoftBank in that particular one. And then you raised some capital thereafter, which then took us obviously north of $2 billion. And ultimately, it was just knowing that the market we're targeting was big enough. Because something I often reflect on is, do I think I'm a better entrepreneur or business person than, let's say, the person, down the road from me that sells newspapers? Even though I don't necessarily read them, I still buy them because he's such a good salesperson. Yeah. But I find that because the problem we're solving, from a GO1 perspective, being, professional learning, is a global problem. And the reality is your business can't be more valuable than the problem you're solving.
Yeah.
And so if you solve a very big problem, you're more likely to be able to create something of lots of value so you can actually capture that value. And so I think it often just comes down to the scale of the problem we're solving that allows us to create and get a larger valuation.
What problem were you solving and how did you find your product market fit?
So ultimately, the problem we're solving GO1 is how do we help people unlock their positive potential through a love for learning? And the issue really comes about where, if you think about education these days, we all know the issue, even more so in Africa, where, there's lots of youth unemployment. People are expected to come with work experience, but then also when they're on the job, they aren't necessarily getting skilled enough. And there's increasing trust being put on employers and governments to skill people outside of formal education. Because there's always a debate around, does formal education prepare you for the workplace?
Sure.
And so that workspace, that professional learning becomes more and more important. And ultimately what we want to do is say, look, just because you're sitting in Africa, that doesn't mean you can't have access to the best-in-class training around the world.
Sure.
Technology enables that. And so our simple premise was, how do we go find the best instructors, trainers around the world, bring their video content or summaries or digital content into one subscription and then offer that at scale. And so, I mean, just for context, I mean, so now we currently have teams across 20 countries, but we have clients in over 60. And the premise is because of our scale of being able to aggregate, think of us like a Spotify but for professional learning, we're able to aggregate over 100,000 summaries, courses, videos into one ecosystem so that every customer gets the economies of scale and ease of use that we're able to provide in our platform. And so that's where really the problem we're trying to solve is like, how do we unlock that positive potential through a love for learning, but make it more accessible?
What does it take to scale a startup in Africa?
It's an interesting one. So I remember when we began the business, so it was a classmate of mine. So I was doing my master's at the University of Oxford, and Andrew was a classmate of mine, and we also then had his high school mates as well. We came together. And it was interesting at the time where people weren't clear whether there was value in commercial value in building businesses and education. Because historically, education, unfortunately, many of the strongest entrepreneurs that get into education also lose sight of the business model and the sustainability elements of it. So it's almost more like we focus on impact, not necessarily how do you make it sustainable. And so I think we had just joined a incubator called Y-Combinator.
Yeah.
I think it must have been 2 weeks in, actually. So Andrew and I were busy working on our dissertations at the time. And I remember we saw the news of Linda, which became LinkedIn Learning, being acquired by LinkedIn for like $1.2 billion.
Okay.
And so it's awkward now. You're trying to fundraise, and guys like, but surely, you know, LinkedIn will be bigger than you, and how do you compete with them? But also it was good because how it's evolved was it also showed that, hey, there actually is value to be made in online learning, in skilling, in development, in actually upskilling people in that particular way. And so I think there's definitely been evolution where we are more online training. And I think back then, if you had to go to a company or government and say, hey, let's train people online, they would be like, no, we don't want to go online because people enjoy getting a per diem every day when they go to in-person training, and there's a distraction. Whereas I think definitely COVID did help in terms of trying to say, like, look, things can be done digitally and remotely, and there's also significant cost savings and richer learning, which is actually the main thing from a learning perspective. But I think it definitely has evolved and matured, but still a long way to go. I mean, to the point you mentioned earlier, I think there are, of the unicorns in Africa, you know, most of them are fintechs, you know, to education/human capital adjacent. Yeah. And so it's one of those spaces where I think there's so much potential because there's so much you can do in education in Africa, and even globally, to be fair, where it's just about the right capital, the right business model, the right people driving that business, and you'll do fairly well.
You raised more than $400 million of round funding. What did you use it for, and how did it help to scale the business?
So you don't know it's working until you look back, right? I think it's something, you know, at building a business, your head's down, you're fully focused on what you're doing. And the biggest thing is, yes, you know, the thing is, so for example, so Andrew, my partner, I was more on the product side, I was more on that growth, revenue, and other parts of the business. And, you know, if I had to ask my first 10 customers why they bought the GO1 platform at the time, called Aduro then, they all had 10 different reasons. So, you know, when you think about like product market fit, it's almost like the point at which you say, fine, I've got a product that I know my target market for, the problem I'm solving, the price point they're willing to pay, and now we're just about like, you know, trying to optimize, tweak, and continue to scale that particular business. Whereas I think early on, especially in B2B or B2B sales, is people often buying from people. So depending on what I said, they bought, but it wasn't like that was the need that they were solving. But I think for...
But how did you manage like to understand that? Because, you know, sometimes you're so focused on your products and what you want to sell that you ignore what people are saying to you.
No,
you know what I mean?
It's so true. I mean, like, look, also, I think it's also about being humble enough to know that, you know, so I was what, we're all young in our 20s at the time, and, you know, we're dealing with like HR managers of very big companies. I'd never managed people. I wasn't an HR manager. So you also have to realize that we're building a product for people who we aren't the target audience for. Sure. And so that humility of actually listening to people and saying like, look, you know, and no one will ever tell you, oh no, your product stinks, it's rubbish. But it's also trying to understand how is someone using your product? And then by that you get feedback. And you're like, okay, what's not valuable? What features aren't being used? And actually asking very pointed questions. And so for us, I think what helped us grow over time was when we began the business, we were a learning management system. Think of it like a LMS, think of it like a shelf, right? And so typically companies would then go put their training courses, their PowerPoints on this particular platform. So if you're selling the shelves, no one buys a shelf without wanting to put something on it. And so we realized actually if you're selling a shelf, why not sell the books with it? And so now our core offering is the books. It's more the content library. But it was us being very humble and saying, okay, look, we're selling a shelf, but naturally, if you want a shelf, you probably want to have books on those shelves. So let's just sell you the books on the shelves together. And I think it's also about just being responsible. Because yes, were we growing, 20% month on month for 3 years, whatever it was. Yes, we were, but it was a function of us staying very close to the customers. It's more the humility than anything else that I think you realize. Actually, you don't know everything.
Interesting. And on the way, you raised I think $400 million, right?
Yeah, just not the
When did when did the first funding happen? And how did it serve the growth? What were the objectives of each round for you?
It's interesting. The early stages, obviously friends and family, but I think even early on, you're getting credit card debt. So once you can't funding, Amex has funded us. Thank you, Amex, for the early days. But definitely for us, so now, obviously, thinking about things now, so now more active in the venture capital space and, what needs to be true for you to raise funding? And I think often it comes down to what are you using that funding for? Often it's just staying alive, but different business objectives. And I think for us, the different rounds we raised, so, we did a small round, pre-YC, and we rolled that up. But I think our first, call it, main round was post Y-Combinator. And that was actually and look, at that point in time, we did have some customers, but then we're focusing really on compliance training because America was big on compliance and so forth. But it really was still validation of the business model, right? And I think at that point in time, this is now in must have been 2015 at the time when we finished up at YC. And we raised a round off the back of that, a safe note. And it was, again, validating that model. Because remember, we hadn't built in the US or those kind of markets, but we knew that the US was a big market for us because that's the biggest training market in the world. And I think we were very intentional about saying, how do we also compete in the big markets? Because we know, yes, South Africa, Australia, we can do these things, but also it was different. And so anyway, you progress to the different rounds. And so the last round we raised, I guess, was our Series D2, if you want to call it that. And again, there it's more growth round, right? It's saying look, we're raising capital so we can grow. And the simple debate is this, when you think about at a board level, do you raise capital or don't you raise capital? The question is, what are you going to use the capital for and what does that unlock? So if you're going to raise, $100 million at a $2 billion valuation, call that 5% dilution, will your business be able to grow more than 5% than it would have without the capital? If yes, it's a good trade. And so I think it's about thinking through how you think about that allocation, but at different levels of different things.
And you talked about YC. It's kind of a dream place for any entrepreneur.
Yes.
What did it teach you in terms of business? Did it kind of expand your ambition when you went there?
Yes, interesting. I think the most value from YC, I think one is you've got, so after YC, typically after 3 months, there's a demo day where you all get together, pitch your businesses, and you actually try to raise some capital. But I think for me, the most valuable part of YC was actually engaging with the particular partners. Because that's when you really got specific advice. Yes, and through the office hours. And so, early on, just basic things when we began the business, we had a different name or URL for our company called Aduro, which means spark in Latin. And the quick feedback was you have to make sure you own your .com at the time. And so Aduro as a name didn't scale across different geographies because of the pronunciation. Then we looked at, okay, fine, can we be the GO1 source for learning and development. And then we looked at go.com to see if we could buy the domain. It's the holding company for Disney. And so we couldn't at the time afford to buy Disney.
Expensive.
Wasn't able to gear that up. And so it's ultimately, settled on GO1. But just thinking about thinking about going global at first and, thinking about our go-to-market and our sales. Which is very important. Because, I don't think I've ever been a fan of sales, but I think just being very methodical and thinking through, whether you're pitching an investor, an employee, or a customer, and just really honing how to be more methodical in our approach of things, especially at that early stage. Because sometimes as a founder, there are hard truths you need to hear. And I think sometimes hearing from someone who's built multiple businesses goes a long way. And I think I find that even now, as a VC, just trying to be hey, how do I share my school fees with founders that I back? Because there are things which you won't know until you made the mistake. And you're someone should have told me that. And I think that's where YC does particularly well because the founders are very helpful.
Nice.
And what, if you had to give some advice to people, to entrepreneurs who want to join YC, what would you tell them?
I think ultimately, don't be yourself. I think many people try to solve a lot to be I want to come across as a hacker. I want to do certain things to get into YC. I think be yourself. I think in YC there's a bias towards more, not technical, but people who are hackers, more scrappy. And so just like, and the best founders are that, when you're like, how are you making a plan? How are you making things happen? How are you thinking about things differently? And ultimately, the same thing about YC, just because you don't get into YC doesn't mean you won't build a big business.
Sure.
And I think it's important. People often think like, oh my gosh, I didn't get into YC, there's nothing left for me. No, I mean, like, and same like, even as an investor, right? It's like, fine, accept the no, but the reasons behind it may be multitude of things. Maybe people are risk off on Africa. Maybe that space they think is crowded in your country, whatever. It doesn't mean you're not going to make money and build a big business. And so I think one, show up as yourself, but also be okay with the no, because the no doesn't necessarily mean you're building a bad business.
And when you started, where did you start? Like, where, like, in which country? And
yeah. So actually, when we incorporated the business, we were actually studying in the UK at the time, or we're just finishing up our studies in the UK, but we already had entities in other countries, in South Africa and Australia.
Okay.
So during the YC process, we had to almost like reincorporate our business in Delaware to be able to get the capital and do certain things in that regard. But luckily, we're still very early stage at that particular point in time. And so I think in the early days, plus where HQ was, and like we're all on planes. I mean, I was probably in 3 countries, like for a third a year. Okay. And so all of us were flying, because the reality is we knew that like big markets for us were like, okay, fine, looking at some Western markets like the US, but we had our home markets in South Africa. My co-founder was Australian, and so we were doing business there. Yeah. And so what we used to just like travel a lot. Only problem is, you see, my co-founder, because Australia is far from everywhere, he quickly got to gold platinum status very quickly. And I was busy arbitraging for the cheapest airlines. See, the problem is I wasn't loyal to the airline, you see. I wish I chose one airline 10 years ago and I would have been like a captain by now.
And what part of the business is African markets today?
Yeah, so interesting. So primarily in Africa, our biggest market would be South Africa still. And I think that's a function of also market maturity. I think the reason why the US is a bigger market for what we offer is because there's more market maturity. The businesses value it more.
Sure, yeah.
And also that's true, I think, expenditure-wise by companies, because we typically are a B2B offering. And so that's B to businesses, B to organizations, B to government from that perspective. And so that's where we'd see the biggest market from that perspective. That being said, I think there's like we've got clients across the continent. I mean, like probably in terms of users, we've got users probably across like 16 markets in Africa. But ultimately, it's about being able to, one, build your tool, and then also know which markets is most compelling in. I think that's a key thing. I remember once we were supporting one of the governments in Africa with the local government elections post-COVID to help them train all the new like government officials.
Okay.
And in tech, you often say like, oh no, it's in the cloud, it works everywhere. But literally when you're going to the crevices of every country, every single municipality, every single like whatever canton as it were, that was a very test moment. So I think definitely, whilst we have clients in different spaces, I think what I found about the African experience in terms of the product and the engagement has been, it often is about saying like, look, can you really be performant and really have a product that can be used by someone that's necessarily a tech native? I mean, I remember the oldest government official was 82 years old. And I was like, okay, not the typical target audience.
Yes, but okay, why not?
Well, yeah. And that's where user experience and that stuff becomes important.
That's right. Have feedback from them and so on.
Exactly.
When you started the business, what were the market where you start first, and what are the other markets that you're present in now?
Yeah, so interesting. So primarily in Africa, our biggest market would be South Africa still. And I think that's a function of also market maturity. I think the reason why the US is a bigger market for what we offer is because there's more market maturity. The businesses value it more.
Sure, yeah.
And also that's true, I think, expenditure-wise by companies, because we typically are a B2B offering. And so that's B to businesses, B to organizations, B to government from that perspective. And so that's where we'd see the biggest market from that perspective. That being said, I think there's like we've got clients across the continent. I mean, like probably in terms of users, we've got users probably across like 16 markets in Africa. But ultimately, it's about being able to, one, build your tool, and then also know which markets is most compelling in. I think that's a key thing. I remember once we were supporting one of the governments in Africa with the local government elections post-COVID to help them train all the new like government officials.
Okay.
And in tech, you often say like, oh no, it's in the cloud, it works everywhere. But literally when you're going to the crevices of every country, every single municipality, every single like whatever canton as it were, that was a very test moment. So I think definitely, whilst we have clients in different spaces, I think what I found about the African experience in terms of the product and the engagement has been, it often is about saying like, look, can you really be performant and really have a product that can be used by someone that's necessarily a tech native. I mean, I remember the oldest government official was 82 years old. And I was like, okay, not the typical target audience.
Yes,
of what we're doing.
but okay, why not?
We're here. And that's where user experience and that stuff becomes important.
That's
so
right. Have feedback from them and so on.
Exactly.
And today, so you have 20 different offices in the 20 different countries you're in, or?
Yes, so
Yeah?
So
Yeah, right.
from the physical teams, well, actually we have more offices. So some countries have more than one office.
Okay.
So for example, in Australia we have probably now 4 offices. In the US we have 2 offices. We've got one here in Paris. So it just depends.
Okay.
So certain markets are bigger than others, and so they have
Yeah.
more than one office. But in terms of physical teams, you have physical teams in more than
Okay.
20 countries.
And like, how many people are you in total?
Just under now 900.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah.
And what were the main challenges you faced when it comes to hiring those people in different markets, while trying to keep the corporate culture kind of consistent?
Yeah, look, I mean, look, the one thing is, as long as you hire guys that are smarter than you all the time, it makes things easier. So obviously, being one of the early ones, we're probably the bottom of the barrel. But definitely, I think, look, business is people. And so for me, I'm a big believer that whether we're in tech or otherwise, that the best people will get you the best results. And so the big thing is, how do you, to your question, finding people with the right skills is one thing, but I think the culture fit's a big one, and more mindset than anything else. And so at that level, it is about finding people that, you feel you can grow and scale with the organization, but also being direct that certain people, because if you're a hyper growth organization, the reality is that a skill set that will get you from 1 to 2 won't get you from 2 to 20.
Yeah.
And I think it's also about being very intentional about saying, like, look, what does the business require and what skills do you require in the business, and not being so egotistical or insecure that you can't necessarily find someone who has better skills than yourself.
Sure.
And I think that's something which is very important for us, I think, as founders in the business, where, we're very clear on, like, look, bring people in with the right skills, not about like, oh no, you don't have a job or you're not relevant. It's about saying, like, look, we have a shared ambition and impact we want to have on the world. And to achieve that, we need certain skills. And so when you think about hiring, it is about finding guys fit for the role, but also depending on what level, whether you're looking for senior guys or junior guys, there's different things you look for. I think often for senior guys, we're fortunate to have a really strong leadership team across our exco where people have been there and done that at very large organizations, from Google to Salesforce to LinkedIn. And so these guys have been there and done that, because none of us have built a business bigger than GO1.
Yeah, sure.
And so that's the key learning.
Interesting.
And
Sorry, go ahead.
how do you attract those people, like
Yeah.
people from Google, etc., like in terms of benefits, maybe prior branding? How do you do that?
Yeah, look, people join for a myriad of reasons, but I realized, to your point, I think benefits is one side of things. I mean, I don't think I can outcompete Google on benefits. I don't have like beds and stuff in my office, but I think definitely it's alignment on the mission and the vision. And I say this very particularly because if I was building a very esoteric B2B SaaS company, like some esoteric part of the finance solution for big companies, like AP Recon or something, I wouldn't be able to attract the level of talent I have.
Yeah.
Because the reality is, because of the mission that we're trying to solve, we're attracting people who are like, yes, I want to have an impact in the world and I also want to do good and do well. And so from that perspective, I think we attract different people, not only because of the space we're in, but the mission of the company. Look, for us, I mean, we want to train 1 billion people. And we've got a very long way to go to get there. And so I think people are willing to come on that journey with us. But also I think people are attracted to the culture. I think something that's true across all my organizations that have either built, invested, or started, and has been trying to make sure you have a really strong culture that does encourage the best people and also incentivizes the right behaviors. And so that's what we think on.
And how do you do that? Like, when you say like I'm building a strong culture, how do you do that?
Yeah, I think it's not about building necessarily, and I think strong, it doesn't mean it's strong as in like, so yesterday we had our raclette, as I mentioned, we had our office party, and there were different cheeses on the cheese board, and some were stronger than others. I don't think when I say strong culture, I mean like strong as in like, oof, that strong aftertaste. It's more so strong as in like, it's a aligned culture which people can identify with and actually in its best sense has a positive outcome on the world, because there are very toxic cultures out there as well. And doesn't mean you can't build a big company with the toxic culture. You can, and history's shown us that. I think for us it's one where people can come and show up as themselves and show up as their best selves. I think, because showing up yourself speaks to more like, do I feel included? Do I feel like a space where I can work and learn? But also show up as your best self means that, you feel encouraged and enthused to bring your best to the workplace, whether that's how we service our customers, how we approach our work. It's about different levels to that. And I think that really just comes down to, I often believe that whilst culture is a function of behaviors in an organization.
It is.
And, often you can say, look, show me how you fire, promote, hire, all those good things. You'll quickly tell what the culture of the organization is. And so I really try to take a humanistic approach when I think about the business, and it starts from the top. The culture you set is the one that will grow, because it'll be like, okay, fine, I want to end up being, a CEO of this person. How do you then make sure that's true? And I think that's where, from the beginning, it's about also then stamping out and calling out behaviors that aren't aligned with the culture.
Okay.
I think something like as we were growing and scaling in our business, early on in GO1, so early on we had teams. We had teams in South Africa, America, Australia, Vietnam, and I think Nigeria at the time.
So diverse,
and,
yeah.
and I remember, there was an issue when there was and our developers then primarily in Australia, because my CTO was from Australia and Vietnam. And I remember there was a time, for some reason, when there was like a bug in the system, guys would be like, oh no, that was Vietnamese code. And, and like it's something which like, now we look back, we're a very small company then, but that could have been existential to the business, because now you're creating us versus them. And it's almost like, and so we're very intentional at that point in time about saying, look, how do we, one, acknowledge that that's not the kind of culture you want to promote, where it's not because of someone in the country, that's the kind of code they write versus not, which actually wasn't the case. But in the same vein, also then saying, how do we create those better bonds across different offices? And so we created different programs to address that. And so very obviously now, one of the big values around like, one team, and how do we do that? But I think it was through proactive work around nipping and taking out stuff that wasn't aligned to the culture.
And how would you define the GO1 DNA?
Yeah. I think the GO1 DNA would be defined as one team, I think would be the biggest thing, because we have so many people in different offices around the world, but ultimately united by a vision 41 to achieve as a company. And the question is, how do you win as a team, and how do you come together as one team? And I think not getting, lost by geographical lines or product lines and so forth.
And if maybe some entrepreneurs are listening and have like different teams in different countries, what advice would you give them to have this one team, assets? I
think it's one about rewarding the right behaviors. I think often a meritocracy where you reward someone on the work that they do goes a long way, because people strive for excellence, and excellence isn't a function of the country you're in. It's a function of the work you do. And I think realizing that, I think, is also very important. But also, I think in the same vein, create opportunities to cross-pollinate and connect. I think it's so important. Like, something I used to do before COVID was like, if you join the company, I would send you to a different office for like 1 or 2 months, just to like, and you make friends. It may not be your core office, whatever it is, but I think that enabled you to understand and have a diversity of views of how people come from. I remember when I did my postgrad studies, I remember in my first year, there were 64 of us in the class and 36 different nationalities.
Okay, yeah.
And I remember like, just thinking through, like, my gym partner back then was the former deputy minister of minerals in Afghanistan, and our other gym partner was advisor to like the minister, the president of Malawi. And, you take for granted the biases you have because of your cultural experience. And so how do you create not necessarily a tolerance, but an understanding of different cultures, especially in different teams? And that it means different cultures, different work styles, different backgrounds. And so I think that's where, through running multicultural teams, it's important to celebrate those differences, as opposed to make it seem like, no, we're one monoculture, because on Slack we all look the same.
And just before you talk about like the behaviors that you congratulate people when they have like the good behavior, did you make those behavior explicit or not?
Well, I think so. Yes, you do, and I think it's important. So something which we used to do at GO1, all hands every week was like, how do you give a shout out to someone? So if anyone who's helped you this week or done something for you, how do you say thank you to them? And there's a time where Alec is like everyone just like, gives a shout out. I think just creating a culture of saying like acknowledging even the small stuff someone does and celebrating them is really key. And I think by doing that, you create the sense of not only recognizing other people, but also paying attention to the good people do.
Sure.
And by doing that, it's not only about me as as a leader saying, oh, well done for that. Well, it's like you saying, hey, no, this guy helped me with that. Thank you. And you create that culture. Yeah.
Gotcha.
What is the biggest next step for GO1 right now?
World domination. Oh, I think definitely for GO1, right? If you think about the business, so whilst we're in many countries, we've got some significant scale, but there's so much white space in the space that GO1 operates in. I mean, like, we literally are a small company in a very, very big market. And so the question, yes, we acquired a business in France 2 years ago, we acquired one in Germany last year. But even then, it's just thinking through how do we deepen our product offering and deepen our reach of the business and the markets we find ourselves in. And so it's both going deeper and wider at the same time because there's so much white space. Like I mentioned to you earlier, our goal is to train, 1 billion people. I mean, even on the most generous, interpretation, it's still, early, small hundreds of millions that we've reached. And so there's so much potential what we're building now. I mean, our proudest metric in the business today is that, every 1.2 seconds, someone completes a course on our platform. But whilst that adds up, it's still not the scale we want. And so a long way to go from that perspective.
Okay. So just before you told us that you've invested in 9 businesses in Africa, right?
That's correct, yeah.
So maybe we can shift on this, your investment role, your VC role. Yeah. Can you tell us more about that? Like, what made you turn into an investor?
Yeah, and so in our GO1 journey, as I mentioned, we've raised a fair bit of capital, and in that process interacted with many capital providers, VCs and others, both locally and abroad. And, really struggled to find, particularly in the African context, investors that had experience building technology businesses, especially in the VCs, like VCs who had investor or founder experience from that perspective. And, sadly, our first African investor was in our Series D round. 2015, I emailed everyone I knew. I said, hey, we're building this business. we had just under $1 million revenue. We're like saying, hey, this is us. And everyone was like, not tech, a bit too early, too risky, we don't get it. Look, now you can probably get the money. I think there's a lot more money in the early stage. But the question is also, what kind of experience are the investors bringing to bear?
Sure.
And so for me, I always told myself, like, look, even working with global investors, I want to be the investor I wish I had when I was building my business. Because I think there are many things that I experienced. I was like, that would have been nice if someone did that or someone showed up differently there. And so ultimately, we're trying to build it bigger, is be the investor I wish we had when we were all building our businesses. So so Briga, obviously, one of the fastest growing VC funds in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And ultimately, all the partners and investment team are former operators and founders. And so we have the level of understanding, but also empathy for the founder journey. And so how do we then leverage that to be able to back the next generation of innovators, particularly in the African context? And so it's really more so applying oneself in that regard. And yes, I've been an active, angel investor for a number of years. But because we are like hands-on in how we service and support our companies, the reality is that we also want to be really meaningfully aligned with them on that journey, because we want to be true partners. And so that's how we think about, backing the next generation of innovators.
And you just talk about like the empathy you have like with the African entrepreneurs. What are the main differences that you notice from the African entrepreneurs than the others, in Europe and the US?
Yeah, I think it is different. I mean, because the markets are different and different challenges, right? And so I think you also are required to different things. I think you think about like basic infrastructure is different. Funding markets are different as well. Like, I mean, the cost of debt in Africa versus in Europe is totally different. So it almost does require to have different business models. I think what you typically find is some of the strongest entrepreneurs we're seeing these days in Africa are often ones that have studied abroad. Now, typically it's more America abroad, yes, sometimes in Europe. And what's interesting there is because they've seen, let's say you go to, Harvard Business School, and you see that your colleagues have gone and built like very large business in the US, and you're like, but I was smarter than this guy in this class, like how's this guy?
Why not me?
and so people are coming back to Africa having seen these models being built elsewhere, like seeing tech entrepreneurs do fairly well, peers, classmates, whatever it is, and they almost bring that level of like, one, ambition, but two, hey, I want to build things really big and I want to execute at that level. And so that's something which is very interesting, which I think you don't necessarily find as much in Europe context, whereas I think, in Europe you might, and I think this is still true in Africa, but just generally what I see is more so like Europe, you don't necessarily have to have the exposure of what's happening around to really try to build what best-in-class looks like. Sure. Also more mature market. And so there's a lot more capital funding out there. And I think you'll see that in the valuation pricing and just the competitiveness for particular rounds. I think if you think of just pure numbers, the reality is, so let's say last year, so African VC was probably about $3.4 billion. The year before was probably about $5 billion. So obviously the tech winter has been a slowdown. But that's arguably the same size of about Spain, right? So the whole continent's getting as much VC as Spain is getting. And Spain's not a big player
Not
in
a
the
big
VC
player,
space in
no.
Europe. And so I think that's where, again, because there's more liquidity, of capital and other things, you tend that entrepreneurs will also approach how they build differently. And I think it's all true. I mean, I remember during out of COVID, we're having a conversation with Reid Hoffman, so one of the co-founders of LinkedIn. And he was saying, like, look, his emerging market portfolio versus American portfolio, what he finds is the emerging market portfolio companies were faring COVID better because they were able to work in more resource-constrained environments than, let's say, the typical American VC where there's lots of capital or venture-backed company. And so I think there are those differences there in how they build, and also just because the problems are different.
Okay.
Yeah.
And maybe as an investor right now, like what are the main qualities you're looking at entrepreneurs? Maybe some that you already quoted.
Yeah.
Are there some others? And if you can also take us through like the investment you already did, what do they have in common?
Yeah. What they have in common is they all have potential to be billion-dollar businesses.
Money.
So, but I think definitely, so, where we invest, particularly when you think about the African context for Briga, is we're early stage. That's pre-seed seed. So we're typically your first check into you as an investor. So we come in fairly early. And so at that point in time, you aren't necessarily saying, oh, no, how much revenue do you have and how sticky your client base is, at least in the earliest of stages, right? And so it almost comes down to the people. And this is true for big businesses and small businesses, but I think it's like the entrepreneurs themselves. Do they have a learning mindset? Are they willing to learn? Because a big part of our value proposition is to share our learnings. So if someone's not receptive to feedback and learning, then our value proposition is not valuable for you.
Sure.
And then we're just like any other money in the market. In the same vein, you want an entrepreneur that is ambitious. And ambitious is a function of like, what do they want to have an impact on? What are the goals and aspirations for themselves? But also in the same vein, it's also then having the ability to also execute and get things done. I think many people, it's sexy to be an entrepreneur right now. The question now is whether one is able to really do the work that's required to get there. And so if you bring together the resilience and grit, the ambition and just the ability to work hard and the willingness to learn, you find that entrepreneurs are very strong. And then the question is obviously understanding why this problem for you. Because if you understand that, you'll know why guys are aligned.
I just want to have your vision about something that we used to hear from people. People used to say, like, in French-speaking countries in Africa, they don't know how to do businesses. That's why we don't have, big companies and so on. Whereas in English-speaking countries, like South Africa, like Egypt, like Nigeria, Lagos, my God, there are, a lot of big companies.
Yeah.
How do you explain that, or what is your vision about that?
Yeah. So I think, it's a bias, and I think the nuance is often what explains the reason. So same way one would argue there are less unicorns in Africa. Does that mean Africans can't do business compared to Americans? No. I mean, there are over $350 billion revenue businesses in Africa. So I think Africa, in the same way, I think to the dichotomy of Francophone versus Anglophone Africa, I think it comes down to depth of markets and maturity of the ecosystem. Because there are big French businesses. I mean, there are big French businesses in Francophone Africa, big Francophone businesses elsewhere. I think it's more so a function of the depth of, and I think in the tech space, the VC markets. The reality is, if you think a few years ago, for many years, South Africa was the biggest, VC economy in Africa. Now that's become Nigeria, and that's become a function of that because they've been bigger companies being built there and entrepreneurs are pushing. And so I think it's just a function of, and look, in our portfolio, we come across really good companies in Francophone Africa. I mean, so our particular investment portfolio, we're across 6 different countries of the 9 companies we have in Africa directly, of which, 3 of them are in Francophone Africa.
Okay.
And, again, those entrepreneurs aren't of a lower quality. I think what you do find, though, is the market dynamics are different. I mean, if you're building in Guinea versus South Africa, it's a very different kettle of fish. And so it's more so that than anything else. But I think it's a function of time. Like with any markets, I think particularly investing, as more investors realize returns, there'll be more money coming back into the ecosystem. I mean, many of the biggest Silicon Valley investors are people who sold their businesses and then were able to reinvest. I think as we see more value creation in Anglophone and Francophone Africa, you'll see the money come back. But the reality is, if you think about the biggest VC markets in Europe, or you've got America, then you've got UK, those are English-speaking markets.
Sure.
And the reality is people will do business with people who they can connect with and engage with. And so from that perspective, often language, sadly, can be a barrier to do that. Because ultimately, at this point in time, the Francophone African market is somewhat almost constrained by the size of the French market, because that's the more likely your Western counterpart investing. So that will change over time. I mean, for example,
Hopefully.
we're a Pan-African fund.
Yeah.
But if you had told me, like, one of my first 10 investments have been in Senegal or Guinea, I would have said no. But it's about saying, how do we proactively look for entrepreneurs who aren't necessarily just from our communities, but also different areas, and adding value in those spaces.
Cool. Thank you.
And for our listeners who want to start an entrepreneurial journey, what advice would you give them, and what would be the sector to focus on? Would you kind of advise to
the growing sectors?
Well, if you want to start one, I'm asking, why haven't you started already? I mean, I think we should definitely. I think entrepreneurship is a function of a bias to action. I think there's never a perfect time. I think about when I was working in corporate and thinking like should I start a business? I think often it's about starting and getting going. And I think there are different ways one can get going into testing the market, and don't be afraid to do things at a big scale, because I think that's where the real value is created. I think in terms of spaces that are exciting, I think it comes down to the market you find yourself in. I think one thing about Africa is whilst many people see there are many challenges, that actually means there are many opportunities. And so, for us, I think, we ultimately think of where we focus as one, where the biggest impact can be had, aligned with where we have experience as a team. So, for example, we've all built and invested in businesses in fintech as an example. So for us, it's the 6 sectors, but some are cross-cutting. So, for example, fintech, education, we've got agri-tech in there as well. Logistics is a big one for Africa, because supply chain, trying to unlock that. But even across that, we have cross-cutting ones. So, for example, when you think about a gender lens, gender is across sectors. But we do believe that investing in women gives us higher returns. Sure. And so how do we be intentional about that? Even when you think about the climate transition, right? One of our companies is a leading solar marketplace ecosystem, where they bring together not only a managed marketplace, but also they bring together climate transition with solar to the home, but they also bring financing. So the question is it a fintech, is it a green tech, is it a this? And so often the best businesses are the intersection of those themes. But I often say if you're solving a big problem, you're likely to make big money.
And that's the aim, the big money.
It's a nice conclusion of this episode.
Yes. Thank you so much, Melvyn, for this first part of our conversation, Real Business Talk.